Welcome to another NTS tech session, this time on service discovery. Small agenda. We'll talk about the presentation definition standard first, and then about discovery service, and then small slide on use case specification. So what is required to specify in your use case to make everything work? But largely, this presentation will be about the presentation definition. Presentation definition, together with the presentation submission, is also known as the presentation exchange standard. It's defined by the Identity Foundation, and it's referenced by the OpenID for VP standard. So there's also reference from the EIDAS 2 ARF architectural reference framework to OpenID for VP, and OpenID for VP references this standard. Another way to look at the presentation definition is to see it as a verifiable presentation build definition, or otherwise a wallet query language. So what we previously did in getting access tokens for NTS is that we let the client application, XIS or HCD, select the verifiable credentials themselves at the holder, and then use those credentials to create a verifiable presentation or a JSON web token. So we're no longer going to do that. Instead, we're going to adhere to the things OpenID for VP says and OpenID for PCI, and we let the verifier define which credentials are needed to create a verifiable presentation. And the selection of these verifiable credentials is done by a presentation definition. So in the OpenID for VP and OpenID for PCI protocols, there is a step where a presentation definition is sent from the verifier to the holder, and the holder has to automatically select the correct credentials from its wallet. This is an example of presentation definition. I'll go through all the fields. This is a very small presentation definition. They tend to get very lengthy. At the top, we have a format definition. So a presentation definition can put constraints on the formats of the credentials, but also on the format of the resulting verifiable presentation. So in this case, this format defines that it requires linked data verifiable credentials. So that's designated with the LDP_VC format type. And within those linked data proofs, it wants the proof type JSON Web Signature 2020. And the same goes for the linked data proof verifiable presentation. So the result of the verifiable presentation created based on this presentation definition must be a verifiable presentation with a linked data proof with type JSON Web Signature 2020. Every presentation definition has an identifier because the presentation submission references the presentation definition, and it has a human readable name and purpose. A presentation definition must also define input descriptors, and input descriptors are basically your verifiable credential selectors. Each descriptor has an identifier and one or more constraints. So in this case, there's a care organization credential input descriptor, and it says that it requires a credential to have 2 fields. Each field must have a path selector, and these path selectors are JSON path expressions, and they start with a $sign. So in the first case, there's a credential required which has a type field, and then there's a filter defined which says the type field should be filled with a string value equal to NTS organization credential. These filters are taken from the JSON schema definition. So you can also filter on numbers, you can use regular expressions, and you can use enums, everything you normally use in JSON schema setup for your APIs, for example. The second field that's required here is the issuer field. And in this case, it says, I want the issuer to be a DID example and then its identifier. This is a pretty important construct because we are going to use the issuer constraint to define trust. I'll talk more about that later. There's also a third constraint on the organization.name, which only says it must be a string. It doesn't really care about the value, but it must be available. Okay, so the presentation definition. It defines verifiable credential and verifiable presentation format. It also selects which verifiable credentials are required by using JSON schema constraints, but it also allows for more complex constructs like I want this credential, I want this constraint or another constraint, or I want this group of constraints, or I want that only 2 or 3 constraints match. There are more things possible. For the more complex constructs, please consult the presentation exchange documentation. I don't think we're going to use them in the beginning, but there might be a use case which requires something like that. And it might be well feasible that when we're going to migrate, for example, from our own issued organization credentials to officially issued organization credentials, that in the migration time, we can say we want one of the 2 credentials, not both, one is enough. And then we need the constructs for min-max, for example. In the example here, you can see how we could define the trust in different vendors that are allowed to issue care organization credentials. So in this case, we say, okay, the issuer field, there's a constraint on it. Only vendor A and vendor B are allowed to issue these credentials. This means that those 2 vendors are now trusted for this use case. We also use the presentation definition for the discovery service. Talk more about that later. And it's used by OpenID VP. And it replaces the trust configuration by putting constraints on the issuer. So this is an important step because previously each vendor or each node operator had to add or remove trust by calling an API. But now trust is configured through the presentation definition. This also means that this is an important piece of configuration for the node. A presentation definition configuration should be created as a result of a use case working group, and it then should be officially established. And we talk about the NEN 7522 roles. The use case owner in the end is responsible for determining the presentation definition. It's well understandable that they hire some consultants to check the actual presentation definition, or they will just trust the working group that they have done their work. When this presentation definition configuration is ratified, the use case maintainer publishes this presentation definition on a website or on another official channel. And from this published configuration, the vendors should take a copy and configure their node. And this also, the fact that the use case maintainer publishes the presentation definition, also make sure that change management will be implemented correctly, that only official changes to this presentation definition are taken by the vendors to configure their node. Okay, so that was the presentation definition, something we also use for the discovery service. Currently, in version 5 and previous versions, all publicly issued verifiable credentials are transported between all the nodes. And the combination of the verifiable credential, for example, the organization credential and the DoD document services, then configured or showed which DoD is part of which use case. But you might have, if you've seen the previous tech sessions, you now know that we are no longer going to transport all these credentials between all the nodes. No, verifiable credentials should stay in their own wallet and should not be published over a network. Instead, we're going to change this mechanism to a server-client mechanism. And we're not going to exchange verifiable credentials, but we're going to exchange verifiable presentations. So it's a server-client architecture. And we've previously seen that the use case determines the presentation definition. Also, this server-client architecture is per use case. So for use case A, there can be a different server than use case B. Both the server and client configure the same presentation definition. Use case participants identified through VCs and cryptographic proof. So because each client takes this presentation definition, creates a verifiable presentation from it, and uploads this verifiable presentation, any attestations that are in the verifiable credential are now officially proven by a signature. And these verifiable presentations are downloaded by each of the clients from the server, and then they can, for themselves, check the cryptographic proof, and thus can conclude that any attestations in those verifiable credentials are or can be trusted. For the server, it's not just a presentation definition that has to be configured. Each use case has an identifier. So in this case, it says a overdraft development 3 identifier. The use case participants together have to determine who is going to be the server. And there's a field that says the maximum validity in seconds of an uploaded verifiable presentation. So there's a mechanism that each client uploads a verifiable presentation, which signals that they are part of the use case. And they do this multiple times per day. This also makes sure that any node that goes offline but leaves their intention to join the use case online is now no longer possible because the node is offline, so it won't upload any new verifiable presentations, and the server will evict the old ones. So it's a self-cleaning mechanism. There are no longer any orphaned DIDs that take part in a use case. Any vendor that wants to enable or disable one of their customers, one of their tenants, to join a use case, they can just use several APIs that are available on the NTS node. Basically, there's a post, delete, and a get API, which can be used for enabling a DID for a use case, disabling a DID for a use case, and searching or getting the state for a single DID. What is also good to know is that, take previous slides for this, is that the NUTS node is both server and client for the discovery service. Oh, that's what it says here. So there's no need to implement this protocol yourself. The NUTS node will do this for you. Like I said earlier, the client will automatically upload verifiable presentations for any enabled DIDs. It will also automatically download a list of verifiable presentations from the server, and the server will automatically evict expired verifiable presentations. Both server and client will verify verifiable presentations against the presentation definition they configured, and they will also verify the cryptographic proof against the known public keys from the DID documents. You can switch clients and servers if needed. You can also determine together that a server is misbehaving and just choose another party to be a server. Any NUTS node can act as a server. This also means that the party that's acting as a server, they have no rights or powers or whatever. They just have duties. They must keep their endpoint online, and that's all they have to do, and then it will just work as intended. Yeah. The searching, this is of course the interesting part, to connect a use case to your user interface. Most use cases somewhere have a search field for other organizations, or use a list of enabled organizations to search for endpoints. The new search API, it's not located on the DIDMAN or VCR, it's located on the discovery module. And there you can search for each use case based on JSON path expressions that match the attestations of the credentials used. So for each use case, you must look at the presentation definition, look at which JSON path expressions are used there, and those fields can be used as search parameters. So in this case, we say we want to search for any care organizations that start with care. So the asterisk can be used as wildcard. And we search on the credential subject.organization.name path. So this matches the NUTS organization credential JSON structure. This will give you a list of results, mostly DIDs. And then, of course, there's another step. In the DID documents, you have to make sure the right services are available. So this is a job of the client application. This is something the NUTS node will not do for you. Okay. Combining all these technical things together. So what does a use case need to specify? So for the discovery service to work, each use case requires a use case identifier. And it also requires a server endpoint. So who is going to act as a server and what is their endpoint? And it requires a presentation definition. So for each use case, we have to determine which verifiable credentials are requested and which fields do we want to use for searching. The use case also defines the services within the DID documents, but this is not something new. This is what we already did in previous versions. So for example, a DID document might require a authorization endpoint and a FHIR endpoint for a given service. This still needs to be done. Also, the specification, the entire use case specification, but especially the parts about the discovery service and the DoD document services, have to be published on a trusted source. And we don't have a trusted source place yet. During development, we can use the NTS wiki. And for example, if there's not an organization that's willing to be the official trusted source, we can always host specifications on GitHub, so everybody can see if any commits are verified by any developer public keys that add signatures to those commits. So at least then it's trackable who made changes and why. It's not very user friendly, apart for developers, but then we at least have a place where we can host those specification documents. Also something that's not currently done, and that's something that, for example, the NEN 5 Safety 2020 specifies, is that after there's a version 1 release, change management must be applied. You cannot just change that presentation definition and add or remove, for example, trusted issuers. This is something that has to go through a working group, and any changes to the presentation definition or the entire use case specification has to be approved by the use case owner. Otherwise, it will become a mess, and nodes will no longer be able to effectively operate together. So this was all the theory and technicalities about presentation definitions and the discovery service, and something small about the use case definition. This is where I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll go to the questions from the people in the online meeting.